Welcome back to Talking Dynasty. I am your host, Garrett Price, and I've got my very good-looking co-host with me, Jared. I'm gonna say it every time because you always blush. I don't know why, but you always blush every time I say it.
Shut up, dude. What's up?
See, you get so awkward about it. I love it. But we have a very special episode, and because it's a special episode, we have a very special guest. So we have Matthew Betz joining us today. He is the foremost expert on anything injuries. Anytime I have a question or a player gets hurt, the first thing I do is I head to his Twitter and I check out what he has to say about this player, about this situation. So, Matthew, how you doing, my man?
Oh, I'm doing great. I'm not gonna lie though, Gary. I'm a little offended. I didn't get the compliment that I was good looking, like Jared, unfortunately. But that is
everyone just
accurate.
knows you're good looking. I have to remind people that Jared is.
No, it is accurate because as you can see, I currently have a disgusting goatee going on right now. I'm actually in my brother-in-law's wedding in 3 weeks. He has requested all the guys actually grow out a mustache for this event, which I do not rock well at all. So I look disgusting currently. I apologize to all of your viewers and listeners, but I'm excited to join you guys today.
I think it's a good look.
Thank you.
I'm a fan of facial hair.
I don't think I've ever heard that. That's pretty funny.
Yeah, it should be great. I'm sure the wedding pictures, years from now will come out great.
Right. Are you guys going to rock aviators too? Because I feel like that would fit the vibe.
I haven't heard, but I would not be surprised.
I love it. Well, Matthew, give us a little bit of your background. Obviously, you've become, a big hit on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, on injuries. But that's not the only thing you do. So you can touch on that as well. But how did you get from the medical field and your medical background into the fantasy space, and how did you marry those two things together?
Yeah, for sure. So I, have been out of PT school for quite a while now. And when I was just getting into grad school was really when I started to kind of fall in love with fantasy and become, a true sicko in all forms of Dynasty, redraft with my home league buddies, and then of course the DFS side of things. And so I've always been, a big fantasy fan, obviously a big NFL fan, big football fan. And then when I was, starting to get into treating patients, working in a sports clinic and seeing the injuries that we talk about in fantasy football, hamstring strains, ACL tears, labrum repairs in the shoulder, concussions, stuff like that. At the time, this was a couple years ago, at the time, there was only a few people really doing it in the space. Notably, Stephania Bell with ESPN is kind of the one everyone knows. Right now, Dr. David Chow, Pro Football Doc, he's big in the space. But before those two main figures, there really weren't that many people. And I thought, okay, there might be a little bit of a window here where there's an opportunity to write some articles, create a Twitter, and we'll just see what happens and go from there. And the timing was perfect because when that all happened, the fantasy footballers were looking for new writers. And I sort of had a new angle in of hey, notice no one on your staff is covering injuries. This is what I do. Would this be of service? I tricked them into saying yes somehow. And what's crazy is every year that has gone by, I'm still doing the injury analysis side of things. But, it's hey, we need someone to pick up this article, or hey, we need a new host for our DFS show. Are you interested? And so slowly it's sort of morphed into this kind of perfect marriage of injury analysis, but also looking at the game in a very detailed way, both for Dynasty, redraft, and then as well for DFS.
Awesome, man. Well, yeah, I know, like I said before, I know a lot of people go to you specifically for injury stuff, but you're right. One of the things that Jared and I were even talking about before you came on was, how your DFS stuff has blown up. And, we focus a lot on Dynasty here, but one of the things that we were talking about a couple weeks ago is I think one of the opportunities that's missed for Dynasty players is we have such a long-term outlook on things where I think a lot of Dynasty players should be playing some form of DFS if they're able to, because you get a lot more of the weekly matchups, focusing on the weather, the target shares, and all of the different things that you focus on to build your DFS lineups are still important for Dynasty because you still have to play that weekly game.
Totally, man. Yeah, that's true. And I'm not sure what you guys do as far as your personal approach in Dynasty. When I first started playing, it was I'm going to build this team, and in 6 years it's going to be sick and it's going to be incredible. Yeah. And good luck trying to predict what's going to happen in the NFL. Not in 2 years, not even in a year, in 3 weeks, right? I mean, Cam Akers
Right.
is almost out of the NFL. Like, right, Nick Chubb's done. Like, these things just happen so quickly. And that is a big, I think, weakness that I had originally, was being like, okay, let's get this guy locked up in my roster for the next 6 years. I mean, you guys know we're trading. There's rookie picks, obviously, every year that we're changing our roster. So, yeah, I'm with you. I think I've kind of modified my personal dynasty strategy. I don't know if this is right or wrong, but this is what I do, is I kind of have like a group of like 5 to 8 guys that I'm like, this is my core. And I'm just turning everything over left and right and really trying to go from there, looking at it, honestly, like a year to maybe 2 years of prediction here.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's get in.
I was going to say, I mean, I feel like my strategy is kind of adapted similarly. Like going into it, I was trying to get as many first round picks for the future as I can and like rebuild. I was always obsessed with rebuilding because I'm obsessed with like prospecting and like I love watching college guys and trying to find the next guy that's going to pop in the rookie drafts and stuff. But I feel like so much of the strategy or the narrative has shifted within the dynasty community of like bringing it more into a single year approach. And, you know, you're going for the ship. And like you said, churning your roster, you know, like Kyron Williams right now. Do you sell him because he's, you know, not a great prospect profile, but, you know, Garrett and I liked him on tape. So just those type of things, you know, you got to be tapped in and looking at it at a year approach compared to like 3 to 4 years. I mean, Garrett, what do you do now?
Yeah. It is much more of a, you know, I really don't believe if your rebuild takes you more than 2 years, you're probably doing something wrong. You know, I don't think it should be, all right, I'm going to trade for a bunch of 2026 picks. And by 2028, I'm going to be awesome. Like,
yeah,
I mean, so many leagues, it's unfortunate, but so many dynasty leagues fold by that point, you know? So to try to even project if your league will last that long, let alone the players you're about to draft. So no, I think about 2 years is what I'm looking at. And it doesn't mean you abandon youth. It doesn't mean that, you know, those young quarterbacks don't have immense value because we believe that they're going to be around for a long time. But I think we went too far the wrong way. It was good when Dynasty first started to have more of a forward-thinking approach, but I think it went a little too forward, and now we're trying to scale it back a little bit and be like, hey, let's not get too out of hand. Let's not get too crazy with all this stuff. All right. Well, let's get into some of the injury stuff. This is what we brought you on for. And on the Talking Dynasty show specifically, we like to talk about specific players at times, but it's much more an overall theory approach, much more an overall philosophy of how to play the game, how to view players, not necessarily do I like this player or do I like that player. It's more of like the overall approach to the game of Dynasty itself, more than player specific. So we might touch on a few specific injuries to give like examples or things like that. But most of the questions we're asking you today isn't like, should I start this guy this week because he's got a hamstring? Like, we're not focused on that as much, more so the overall concepts of how do we factor in injuries and how do these play a role in our dynasty landscape. So let me start off with, like, in my opinion, the biggest question, and I know Jared's got some stuff too that he wants to ask, but the biggest one for me is I've heard conflicting narratives on this. Injury prone. Is that actually a thing or is it not? Because I've seen debates on this. Like, in your opinion, are players actually injury prone or is it just kind of luck of the draw at times?
So this is a very difficult, answer to give. You can't give a black and white answer, unfortunately, which is what everyone wants. However, the number one predictor of future injury is a previous injury that's basically the same thing. Meaning, if a player has a history of hamstring strains, they are more likely than someone without one to get a future hamstring injury. So in that instance or situation, like, sure, Will Fuller has always been, when he was around as like the poster boy for hamstring injuries, more prone to get a hamstring injury than a rookie entering the NFL that's never had one, right? So that is definitely a real thing. The same thing is true for Dalvin Cook and his shoulder for years. That wasn't going away. That was a recurring problem. We saw it basically year after year. He was prone to recurring shoulder issues. Now, that's specific. Is Dalvin Cook, just because they had a shoulder issue, more likely to go out in week 4 and sprain his ankle? No, of course not. But you will get in trouble, I think, if you start to throw the injury prone label around as a blanket statement. But it's hard to, look against the data and say that there isn't something to recurring patterns with recurring injuries to the same body part, same region. Another one that's very noticeable, or that's a common thing, is guys that have a history of recurring ankle issues. You see it kind of pop up and then go away and come back, and like that stuff doesn't just go away. They are more prone to feature ankle injuries. So kind of a convoluted answer, but basically yes, to a degree. It's more just when we're looking for this kind of stuff, we're looking more at patterns, not just throwing out a blanket statement, basically.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense logically. I mean, would you say most of J.K. Dobbins' injuries were because, like, they're all related? Because like, the previous injury impacted the current injury, like right now. I don't know how to word that, but you know what I'm trying to say. Yeah. Yes, thank you, Garrett.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. Just with the ACL recovery, which was longer than a year, and then the most recent Achilles injury. Inherently, those two things are not necessarily related. Could you make an argument that J.K. Dobbins has not been in the best, peak physical conditioning in the last 2 years? Certainly, right? I mean, the guy spent the entire season, when he had the ACL injury in that August a couple years ago, missed the entire season, spent the entire offseason rehabbing, came out, had the Twitter war with Rap Sheet, said, I'm not starting on PUP. He said he is starting on PUP. 2 weeks later, he's out there limping around on the field, right? He has the second surgery. He's still recovering. So this guy has literally been rehabbing for 2 years. You just can't get into peak physical football shape doing that. It's just kind of the reality, unfortunately, especially for a lower body injury. Now, that specifically is not why he went out and tore his Achilles, in week 1. That stuff can be very, very fluky. It just takes, the wrong step, defender kind of dragging you in a weird way, stuff like that. So that certainly can happen. But I think you could have made the argument entering the season that Dobbins carried a much riskier profile overall, just given, the last year and a half that he really has had.
Well, this brings us into a good conversation, because ACL injuries, Achilles injuries, like these ones that are the big ones, when it happens, you're like, oh no, like there goes his season. That, like, how is that going to impact his career? So looking at the bigger injuries like that, how should we view those types of injuries long term for a player? And maybe it's even, a little bit different by position, but those big significant injuries, are those ones where we need to stay away from that player long term? And maybe it's different, Achilles versus ACL versus whatever else you want to throw in there as significant injuries. But how should we view those guys as far as rostering them, drafting them, trading for them long term?
Yeah, there's a couple of things specifically with ACL that I look for in predicting players that are probably going to have success and return to form versus those that are not. One of the biggest predictors is draft capital. And inherently, when you think about it, these GMs, these coaches that sink a first round pick into you, a second round pick into you, they're more incentivized to give you a second and third chance than a 7th round rookie, right? Or an undrafted guy, obviously. Now, those are kind of extremes, but that matters. The other thing is age. So younger players coming off an ACL injury are far more likely to succeed than older guys, which, I mean, the Nick Chubb situation is unique in that it was so severe and so, multi-ligament and so many structures are injured. But even if he just had a straightforward ACL tear, if you were betting on him versus someone else coming back, as a 22-year-old or a 23-year-old, you would bet on the 22-year-old or the 23-year-old in that situation. So age matters, draft capital matters off ACL. And the other thing is pre-injury athletic testing. So this is one where, these guys that have incredible Spark scores, or if you use the RAS system, these guys that are super athletic, that have the draft capital, that are young, that's really what you look for. And truthfully, Breece Hall is kind of the poster boy for this. He fits the mold of everything you look for. He was great before injury. We saw it flash in week 1. He's not even 100% right now. So it's coming, that. And so, yeah, those are kind of the predictors that I look for. The tricky thing is, though, is even saying all of that, is that a lot of the research that I have done has shown every player almost across the board in their first season for running backs off the ACL tend to see less touches and are less efficient in their first year. So, it's one of those things. It's like, yeah, they'll get back, but will they return on the investment? Will they be what you drafted them to be? There will be outliers, obviously, but overall, it's an uphill battle in year one. And a lot of the times you'll see for running backs, especially year two is when you really want to see them bounce back. And we saw that most notably last year with Saquon. Came back the first year, struggled a little bit. Second year, looked like he was shot out of a cannon. So yeah, second year off ACL for running backs that are young, draft capital, have the financial commitment from the team.
I'm a little bit biased on certain players. So I am going to touch on one guy, even though I said, like, we're not going to talk about players. We're going to talk about Javonte Williams. I love the guy. He's one of my favorite players in the league. It was, to the general community, very surprising that he didn't go on the PUP to begin the year, that he was playing in the preseason. What are your thoughts on that? Was that an encouraging sign? Was it smart for the Broncos to do that? Should we be more worried about re-injury with him? Like, break down his situation, because it is kind of unique where we do see typically a little more recovery time. And what I think, I don't know, you can tell me I'm wrong, but it seems like we typically see a little bit longer recovery time for an injury like this, but we didn't see that of Javonte. So what are your thoughts on him? Yeah,
totally. And that's definitely a fair statement, is that without getting too into the weeds, basically the more stuff that's injured, like when you have the ACL plus kind of situation, it just takes longer. And that's just kind of the reality of the situation. The rehab is a little more conservative early on. You can't start running as early. You can't start cutting as early, jumping, all those things. So the recovery to not just get on the field, but also to like reach peak performance tends to take longer. And so it was kind of surprising to see Javonte Williams be ready to go off this injury in week one. But, the tricky thing is that every recovery is an individual process. Certain players deal with a little bit more stiffness than others off the surgery. Some players take longer to gain back their strength. And so it is an individual, case-by-case situation. But if you follow the offseason trend with Javonte, it was like there was rumblings from like the combine of like, maybe they don't think he's as healthy as he could be. Like, watch for them to sign a guy. They bring in Samaje Perine in free agency. It's like, okay, let's see what they do moving forward. Let's see if they draft someone. They didn't. Then in the summer, he was participating in a limited fashion at OTAs. It's like, okay, that checks another box. Like, let's see what happens in training camp. Not on PUP in training camp. It's like everything you have heard has gone well. So if you just stuck, to the priors of like, oh, this is a huge injury, he'll never get back from it, he'll never be ready for week one, you probably missed the boat a little bit if you kind of follow the trends. Now, I am still not ready to say that he's back. And part of that is the plan for the Broncos, right? There's a reason Samaje Perine is there. Now, is Perine the best running back in the world? No, but he'll do what Sean Payton wants him to do. And he can work in a committee with Javonte Williams. I do think, though, if you're thinking about next year in Dynasty, the fact that he's back and even just on the field right now is an awesome sign for him being a classic year two running back off the ACL that truthfully could explode next year. So temper expectations, like maybe you're getting, RB2 flex-ish numbers this year from him. But yeah, I certainly think next year we could be very, very excited about where he goes. Like in redraft leagues, I wouldn't be surprised if he's up as a round 2, round 3 type of pick, right? He's got it. He's very good. Everything coming out of college said that. And so, yes, I'm excited for next year for Javonte.
I love it. You warmed my heart. Go ahead, Jay.
No, I wasn't going to say anything there, but I guess, are you expecting his usage to like increase as we go on throughout the year? Like, do you think the Denver Broncos are taking it slow because of his injury? Because his usage has been a little lower than expected because he played in the preseason. I personally thought at this point he may be seeing a little more usage than he is currently.
Yeah, I think when you kind of follow the tea leaves, they've been somewhat honest of saying, we are going to work in Samaje. We are going to limit his touches early. And I think the Denver medical staff has a plan for this, which is good. You don't want to see them just being like, well, let's see what happens if he gets 25 touches and we'll just go from there, right? You need to have a plan of like, okay, in weeks 1 through 4, he's ramping up. I'm making this up, like an extra 2 touches this week or whatever it is, right? So I'm not surprised it hasn't happened yet. I mean, we're only 2 weeks in, of course. But if you told me, come November, that he's kind of now ramping up to like, he's the 1A and Samaje is really in the background as the backup running back, that would not be surprising at all. I do think he will get stronger throughout the year. He'll get more explosive, more confident on the knee, which is something that's hard to measure, but is a real thing, confidence. So yes, I think his November and December will be much better than his September and October.
Cool. All right. How should we view injuries positionally? Because we see some that tend to happen just to football players in general. And we have others that tend to specifically happen to specific position groups more so than others. Are there certain injuries that when they happen to a position where you're like, oh, now stay away from this guy, or, ones that are more concerning? Like, how should we view that in general?
Yeah, the biggest thing that I found is that high ankle sprains for wide receivers and running backs tend to be, and this is probably true for a lot of things, far more of a detriment in season than it is to a quarterback or like a tight end, for example. Running back specifically also definitely more worried about the Achilles type injuries. We talked about the ACL recovery as well. And I found kind of in the ACL recovery research that these guys that actually play a decent amount of slot snaps can perform better at wide receiver off the ACL than these kind of traditional perimeter receivers that need to win downfield. Think back to like last year with Chris Godwin, right? Totally fine fantasy season. Very good, actually, fantasy season. And Gallup certainly struggled with his injury, and he's kind of been a downfield threat. You don't have that second gear to kind of get down the field to win the way that he has historically. So that makes sense. The other thing is these slot guys will see much more volume to hide their inefficiency of play, if that makes sense. So that's kind of one little nuance there. And then another thing I think that is specific, interesting to wide receivers especially, is the hamstring injuries. And it's not that that a running back isn't going to be affected. They certainly are, or a tight end is going to be affected. They will be. But wide receivers, you need to really open it up with your stride. You can't just go 80% and then create separation. These guys are trying to explode off the line and get downfield very, very quickly. So they're running at top end speed for the entire play, essentially. And that's when that hamstring is most stressed. So we tend to see these guys coming off hamstring injuries for wide receivers start a little bit more slowly in their first, 2-ish games back on the field.
Yeah, it makes sense.
It's interesting. I tore my hamstring in college and it still bothers me. Like, I feel like just tighten up.
Yeah.
Every so often.
Yeah.
It's the worst.
It's a high recurrence rate too. Like, think about,
it took me forever.
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure. Think about, these guys that have an injury in season, and then think about like the ideal PT world where we can say to someone, okay, like, if it's a runner or whatever the weekend warrior is, guys in their 30s and 40s getting injured like we are.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, I can take a few weeks off from whatever my activity is that I love to do, and I'll live and I'll be fine and I'll get back in a month or two. But like, these guys are being pushed to get back on the field in 7 days. Like, it's sort of a fight between your body's natural ability to heal and the clicking time, with the clock that is the NFL season. Like, you only have so much time to get back out there and try to make the playoffs and perform and get paid and all those things. So it's a number of factors that really lead to that reduced performance. But yeah, that's why we see that recurrence rate so high for hamstring injuries.
We haven't touched on concussions much, but that's one that affects every position. Quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. We see it happen every year to different position guys and different position groups. Is it true that, similar to how we talked about the ankle injuries and hamstrings and things like that, where once you get one, you're more susceptible to getting more, thinking specifically of like Tua last year. And are there levels of concussions where, like, because everyone talked about how severe Tua's concussion was, or is it like, no, it's just you have a concussion or you don't have a concussion? There's not like levels to it. How does that work?
Yeah. So originally, even a couple of years ago, these were actually being graded as like, oh, it's a mild concussion, it's moderate, it's severe. But then we found out that it's one of the hardest things to actually diagnose, like in the moment. It's not hard to diagnose a concussion. It's hard to say how impactful is this going to be and how long is it going to take to recover. And that is very, very variable from person to person. You'll see guys come back in 6 days, 7 days, and they're back on the field. Other players, it's 2 weeks, it's 3 weeks. And there are a number of factors that go into that. One is a previous concussion. will lead to your second concussion usually taking longer to recover, especially in season. If it's a second one in season, almost always it's a multi-week situation. And it is to some degree a brain injury, right? So you can't just like brush it off and get back out there. There's tests you have to take. And I think the Tua situation specifically last year really made the NFL kind of look in the mirror and say, we cannot have that ever happen again. And because of that, you are seeing almost every week, if a player is concussed, they're not playing the following week. It's over like 80% in the last year or two of guys that are able to actually come back. They almost always miss a game. So the NFL has gotten more strict with their testing policies. The medical field is learning more as years go by. It's still an evolving diagnosis to understand and treat. But yes, there is an increased recovery time for subsequent concussions. The other thing that's sort of interesting with that is that there is a slightly increased risk of lower body injuries when players have concussions, which sounds so weird. You're like, how can that even be possible? But your lower body's, stability system partially comes from your brain telling your body what to do, obviously, not to get too nerdy.
Sure.
But there's an imbalance or an issue with your kind of balance situation, your stability in your lower body. So you see a slightly increased risk for like ankle sprains, knee injuries, stuff like that. It's a small factor to consider, when we're talking fantasy, but it certainly is there in the background.
That's even like after recovering from the concussion, or that's like, if you choose to, maybe you really aren't ready to play that week, but you want to play and you come back in a shorter time frame than expected, or like you continue to play through the game.
Yeah, more of a short-term thing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I got to follow up on the reoccurring concussions. So like Tua had his one concussion and then he had another. Now that he hasn't had one in a little while, is he less susceptible now? Or is he still, because he had those previous ones, he's still like a very high risk?
Yeah, I mean, he's still risky. Certainly, he still carries that elevated risk. The tricky thing that we talk about it from like a how do you handle a situation in fantasy is how can you really ever predict when it's going to happen sort of situation, right? So like you could have him on your squad and be like, okay, well, I'm more worried that this happens again in the future, which totally is logical. But can you actually predict that in this game, he's going to take the hit and it happens? Of course not, right? So it's just sort of it's kind of in the background of your decision-making process standpoint. But yeah, I mean, Tua is still at risk for future concussions more than someone who has never had a concussion.
Yeah, I think that's like baked into his rankings throughout Dynasty as a whole, or his value.
Right.
People are so worried about if he gets concussed again, like, is he done? Is it the end of his career? Or, I think that's what everyone's wondering.
Totally. And that's so hard to answer, right? Because it could happen. And then he, contemplates it again in the offseason and he's back. And then all of a sudden he's chucking it to Tyreek and Waddle and he's awesome in fantasy. So it's such a hard conversation,
right?
And I think the player that sticks out the most that was a factor for years was like Jordan Reed, 7-8 years ago at this point. He was a guy that's like
so good.
Oh, he was dominant, right? When he was on the field. But that was the thing is he had these recurring concussions and he kept missing more time because of it. So you do know it's in the background, it's a possibility, but it's so hard when he's so productive and his guys and his weapons are so good, right?
Especially you're the franchise guy. You're the quarterback. Like they're invested in you being healthy and
totally
you being out there. So
yeah, totally.
I even remember 3 or 4 years back, Brandon Cooks, we were having a similar conversation about Brandon Cooks, and I think it's been a while since he's had one now. So yeah, it's weird how sometimes that happens and it's just like, yeah, they're done. And then other times, then they don't have a concussion for years. So it's wild how that happens.
For sure.
I think I had quite a few concussions growing up, but I didn't know that they were concussions. I just ram my head into like the other players, like in Pee Wee football, Garrett. I just come off the line and just try to hit him as hard as I could with like my head. And I'd be like, oh, why am I seeing stars? Thought I was doing a good job, But now as you get older, you're like, oh, you're doing it the wrong way, dude.
That was probably bad.
Probably not a good idea. It makes sense. I forget a lot of things.
No, man, I do. I remember a specific play, and fortunately, I was never like diagnosed with a concussion. But even how it was viewed when we were playing football back in high school and college and stuff like that was very different than how they're evaluating it now. A lot
Get back in there
over the past 15 years. Oh, 100%.
Rub some dirt on it. Get back out there.
I do remember a specific play. What's that?
I said rub some dirt on it. Just get back out there.
Exactly. He had the smelling salts and that kind of stuff. Like ridiculous. But I do remember one time I gave a couple out, but I do remember one time where I'm pretty sure I had one where I was on the backside of a play and just kind of trailing, and the guy was running out of bounds and the play was over. Well, the lineman in front of me just randomly like turned around at the last minute, and he put his helmet right underneath my chin strap and like just jacked my helmet up. And I remember like I was seeing stars for a second, and I started walking the wrong direction. Like I started walking to the opposite sideline. Fortunately, like I realized after like 3 or 4 steps, I'm like, wait, this is the wrong way. I need to go this way. But definitely in retrospect, I was like, I was probably concussed. All right. Well, let's move on to, concussions are an interesting topic, but one of the big things that I think as fantasy players that we're wanting to know and understand risk factors are there certain red flags, warning signs that we should kind of be paying attention to that could kind of inform us of, hey, this player is at risk for a serious injury, or this player is somebody to really avoid, or this player is somebody you shouldn't be drafting because the risk is high. Like, are there some factors that we could, even if they're just small little things, that we should be keeping in the back of our mind when we're trading, when we're drafting, things like that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes back to what we had talked about at the top of the injury prone thing. Is just this kind of injury history profile. These guys that have multiple ACL injuries, are probably going to have a shorter career. These guys that have had an Achilles injury, it's certainly not happening year 1. It's probably not happening year 2, and maybe it happens in year 3, right? Like that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But as far as predicting specific injuries or predicting significant injuries, there is a lot of data, kind of in your like high school athlete population of certain imbalances in muscle groups, stuff like that. But we're never going to get that information. And these guys are literally the best athletes in the world, or some of the best athletes in the world. And presumably that stuff should all be checked out. So in theory, there is stuff you could look out for, but we'll never know it. And so it's sort of a moot point. But yeah, I think a lot of it just goes back to the injury prone thing of just the older injuries popping back up, or a significant pattern of injuries, specifically guys that like have kind of had these knee injuries and repeated knee injuries. And then like you start to see their efficiency dip. It's like, I'm out, like it's probably not going to come back the way we thought it would. I'm trying to think of a good example of someone like that.
Tajay Spears.
Or Todd Gurley, right? When it started to fall off, it fell off like fast. It wasn't just like a slow decline, right? But yeah, Tajay Spears is a good example of someone that, it's hard to say because it's so early in his NFL career, and he's looked dynamic and he's played without this ACL, presumably for a little while now.
Yes.
But he's had repeated injuries to the same knee. And so, we talked about this at the top too. We're not playing to figure out what Tajay Spears is going to be in Dynasty when he's 29 years old, but would I be surprised if he's a running back that, bucks the trend and plays till he's 30 and still super productive? I'd be shocked, right? So maybe you file that away for in 3 years from now or something. But I do think that he's a good example of a player that maybe we see a little shorter career because of that.
How do you personally balance that upside? The player's awesome, but there's, injury risk versus the guy that's never dealt with really any injuries that you would be worried about them repeating themselves, but they might not be as dynamic or might not have as much upside. Like, how do you personally balance that in your team's portfolios?
Yeah, I think a lot of it just comes down to cost and an opportunity cost, right? Like, I'm trying to think of a couple years ago in redraft leagues when Saquon was coming off the board as like an early second round pick. People were just ignoring the fact that he was coming off an ACL. He's like, well, he's Saquon, he'll be fine, he'll be back. It's like, yeah, maybe, but probably not, right? So opportunity cost is a major thing. along the same lines, like I've always been hesitant to buy into Will Fuller over the years. But there was a year where like people just had enough and they were like, I'm done. I'm not doing this. And then he was like an 8th round pick in like best ball leagues, and like redraft leagues. He was like slipping to the 9th round as Deshaun Watson at the time, who was good, which now is a giant question mark, but at the time was good. And the offense,
we're not going to talk about that.
at the time,
fans
at the time was good. And Will Fuller came out and smashed for fantasy that year, right? So like if he would have been a 3rd round pick, I would have been out. But who cares about your 8th round pick or your 9th round pick, right? So to me, it all comes down to opportunity costs. What does that player cost you to get in a trade in Dynasty? What does that player cost you to draft, in a rookie draft, that sort of thing. So that's really what it comes down to for me.
Makes sense. So are there teams, and this is going to sound bad, like I don't want to like trash any teams, but are there certain teams that when a guy gets injured, you're like, well, it sucks that he's injured, but at least he's with this medical staff because these guys seem to do a much better job helping their players recover than this team? Like, are there certain ones that we should kind of be more optimistic or less optimistic based on if they get injured on that team? Or is that just silliness?
Yeah, that's hard to quantify. I mean, probably could quantify it, but I haven't actually done anything to look at that specifically. Part of that is teams will turn over their staff, training staff, every several years. So you won't really ever get a good sample size. But the Rams have an awesome training staff. They're actually very good with, from what I've heard, working with players to tailor the routine the way that he wants it and the way they want it, and have a perfect, I think, marriage of that situation, which is why I think Cooper Kupp was very successful coming off his ACL in his first season, part of the reason anyway. So that's a team that I think does pretty well. The other one that I always am, in my world of PT and injuries, I'm proud of for being conservative is the Packers. They will not rush a guy out there in week 1 off the hamstring injury, which is why Aaron Jones is sitting, and Christian Watson has been out for the first couple games of the year. I do think, by the way, he plays this week, so hopefully that would be good news. But they are pretty conservative in their players to make sure that they are actually back and not trying to just rush them back on the field.
No, interesting. So like Washington Commanders, that's the first team that comes to mind. That like
the track record has
injury
not been
history. No, it's just like you get injured there, you're doomed.
Yeah, the track record there has been pretty tough.
Yeah. Hopefully with the new ownership group and all that, maybe it'll be a little bit better. Hopefully.
You're like, I don't want to name teams.
I don't want to name teams, but these guys suck. Oh man,
yeah, I don't know the staff there at all or anything. So
yeah, I don't either actually.
First team that comes to mind. Go ahead, Garrett.
No, you're good. So when it's game time, all right, we're ready to play, and you're looking at your lineup, and you have all of these question marks down your lineup, and you're trying to figure out which ones should I feel confident in starting, which ones should I be a little more leery about. How do you normally go about making those lineup decisions? Is it truly like just a case-by-case basis, or are there certain injuries where you're a little more willing to put them out there if they're questionable, as opposed to other injuries where you like to play it a little more conservative?
Yeah, this one I think depends on severity of injury and how quickly they're coming back from it. So we talked about these hamstring issues and these guys that come back and, they tweak it on like a Wednesday and then they're limited Thursday and they miss practice Friday, but they're gonna push through it and play. It's like, oh, man, that's a tough sell for me most of the time. The other thing is, how long has the injury been going on for? So sometimes when we get to the end of the season, especially, you'll see guys just every week, DNP Wednesday with, let's pretend it's an ankle, limited Thursday, limited Friday, plays. And it's like that for like 3 weeks in a row. You kind of know at that point they're managing the injury. It's not new. It's been a recurring pattern. We should expect them to play. And so those guys, I'll keep playing them in that situation. But I tend to be a little more conservative in my decision-making process, assuming you have alternative options. The other thing is, which position is it, right? Of course, like, man, give me 50% of Travis Kelce, right, over whoever the heck else you want to put in your lineup. Like, he's a player specifically, Mark Andrews, those guys at tight end, where it's just so bad. But like wide receiver, we probably all have some decent backup options. Sometimes running back, we'll see. But yeah, it depends on the position, how long the injury's been going on. And then their practice status actually does matter a little bit. I did an off-season research study with the Ballers looking at if you just group players into on the injury report or off, the guys that are on the injury report, not considering anything of like where you drafted them, their playing time. So this is a very elementary study, but if they're on the injury report, they're more likely than not going to hit their season-long average of fantasy points. And if you even take it further and say the guys that are on the injury report and questionable, the numbers got even worse as far as actually hitting their season-long average production. So it does matter, but at some point, there's so many decisions, of course, that go into it of who else you have and other options you have. What's the game environment like? Is it a 55-point total, or this week the Jets and Patriots is like 36.5? like those things matter too, right? So there's a number of different factors.
With certain injuries, like let's say it's an ankle injury. We have a couple guys like Saquon Barkley's a good one. He's dealing with an ankle injury right now. With ankle injuries, are you more than likely going to be conservative if it's their first game back as opposed to, they're still dealing with it, but it's their second or third game back? Or are there certain injuries where you got to kind of see it until you can trust them? Like, are there certain injuries where that changes or not really too much?
Yeah, I think it does, but it sort of is a case-by-case situation, I think, to some degree. And a lot of it, too, comes back to the projected recovery timeline at the time of injury. So, we heard on Saquon immediately, this is going to be roughly 3 weeks. I think it could be anywhere from 2 to 4, but roughly 3 weeks. And so now we've got Brian Daboll telling us he's a game-time decision. I mean, if he plays tomorrow, I'd be shocked. But if he was, let's say, active, I'm not starting Saquon Barkley, right? Like, there's no way he's 100% right now. He's not even 80% right now, even if he does feel better than he did on Sunday. So it depends on the injury, but that's just one example of even though he's Saquon, I'd be nervous.
Yeah, I mean, you risk putting him in your lineup. He's going to test it out, plays 5 snaps first series, and you get a 0. You get a goose egg or whatever he ends up getting you in those snaps. But
for sure,
that's the worst.
Yeah, and too, like, it sounds silly, but it does actually matter quite a bit. Did the injury occur on a Thursday night and these guys are playing the following Sunday or Monday? Yeah, give me a couple extra days to feel more confident about it versus these guys that get injured on a Sunday and they're playing 4 days later on Thursday. Not a chance they're 100%, right? So, I mean, we saw that a couple years ago. Don't sit me, Keenan Allen situation did not go well. Maybe if that game was a Sunday or Monday the following week, he would have been usable in fantasy. But yeah, on these short weeks, it's always very, very tough.
Absolutely. Well, we kind of covered a lot of the stuff that I wanted to get through. Is there any other just general information that maybe we didn't ask you specifically, but if you are playing Dynasty, Redraft, DFS, whatever, is there something that you think people should take away from this and just say, these are some things that I want to remember when it comes to injured players on my fantasy team?
Yeah, one thing that we didn't talk about that I think is always a huge discussion point, especially in August, is week 1. Everyone wants to know, is he going to be ready for week 1? Is he going to be ready for week 1? Once we get to week 1, no one cares what's happening the rest of the season, right? It's always, is he ready for week 1? And I always laugh at that because I'm like, well, that's a single week out of, the entire season that we play, but that's all people care about. And it makes sense when you think about redraft leagues and things like that. But I have found that players that are dealing with injuries that occur in training camp, I mean, it's like a 65% chance that those guys do not hit their redraft ADP from where they were drafted. Let's say they were drafted as like the RB 18 and they finish the RB 36 or whatever it is. They're not going to hit that mark 65% of the time. That's what I have found. So I'm always super conservative on those sort of players, buying the dip, quote unquote. I'm hesitant to do that, especially if the injury took a while. Like we're seeing with Joe Burrow, all off season. It was like, well, he should be ready for week 1. Like, he'll be ready for week 1. It's fine. Ready for week 1. And then he didn't practice at all the entire summer.
Yeah.
They came out, looked terrible in week 1 and now has aggravated it again. And he's not going to be mobile out of the pocket the way that he was last year until end of October, probably, right? So now you're looking at a situation where you're thinking things differently a little bit for redraft anyway, or for this season about T. Higgins and Jamar Chase and Joe Mixon, and it just has a trickle down effect. So I think that's one weakness that a lot of fantasy players have is they just care yes or no for week one, but there's so much more beyond that.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Jared, anything else you wanted to touch on or ask?
No, this is all really interesting to me because, just I'm not an expert in this at all. And the way I always approached injuries was like, I just kind of read the news, and, if a guy's out, then I'm looking at their backups. But I'm glad that we had this conversation because I'm going to take what you said and apply it to the way I play Dynasty and redraft and DFS and stuff. So this was great. And I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, man. I'm happy we could get it together and get it scheduled here. It took a little while, but we got it done. And hopefully your listeners, found it really helpful because it is something I think that there is an edge to and sort of knowing what to look for and not just reading the RotoWorld blurbs, taking it a step further really can make you a better Dynasty player, redraft player, whatever it is.
And that's what we're looking to do here. Like I said, we don't touch as much on specifics as much as how do we play the game. And I think that's a served area of Dynasty where, yes, we like this guy, but we don't like this guy. And we like this guy, but so we're teaching people what to think instead of how to think. And that's what we're really trying to do is how do we look at the game? How do we process the information? How do we process the players? So I think this is another nice little notch for guys that are taking in this information, listening to this, to just have a little bit of an edge. Maybe it's not, game changing or league deciding, but maybe that makes a difference on a player or two that they might have drafted, but now they decide not to, or a guy that they might have traded for, but now they decide not to, or whatever it is. Hopefully those will be the little things that they're able to take away. So Matthew, give us real quick, where can we find you on Twitter? What kind of stuff are you doing right now?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter at @TheFantasyPT. And then right now I am doing all my stuff with the Ballers. I do a weekly injury show. I've got DFS articles every single day coming out, multiple podcasts per week. And then we actually do our own Dynasty show as well, which I host with Kyle. And we have one of Jason or Michael on with us every week. So, man, the season is crazy, but it's a lot of fun. And it's hard to believe that we're already into week 3, but the season is flying by. So that's where you can find all my work. Should be a fun season.